Welcome to episode 27. My name is Jacob Cooper, host of the Wisdom Jacob's Ladder podcast. For those of you who are new to my channel, we love having you on. Please make sure to hit the subscribe button as well as bell notification icon for more up-to-date interviews coming your way, all revolving higher awareness and tools for your everyday life. Today's guest is none other than Paul Perry. Paul is a co-author of a book that I was proudly endorsed of that just came out called Proof of Life After Life. He co-authored with Dr. Raymond Moody, and he and Raymond have co-authored several books together. Paul also, with Raymond, coined the term shared death experience. So Paul is a wonderful documentarian. He's an afterlife researcher, and he's really brings a lot of credibility and foundation to all things higher consciousness through his in-depth studies. So Paul is going to be a wonderful interview. I hope you enjoy our dialogue. And please, without further ado, we bring on Paul Perry. Paul Perry, welcome to my channel, The Wisdom Jacob's Ladder. I am so excited to have you on. I loved your book, Proof of Life After Life, and it was an honor, to write a blurb of endorsement. And you've had certainly a tremendous impact and body of work working alongside Dr. Raymond Moody. But for those of you, my listeners, who may not have heard, of some of your work or what you're about, could you just kind of give us the rundown about your current work that you're doing with Dr. Moody, and maybe a little bit about how you came, into that work, because you are impacting, so many people. I think it's important to really hear, your why. How did you get to this place and your passions?
Well, I first met Raymond. It's actually 35 years ago.
Wow.
And I was in New York. I was living in New York, editing a magazine called American Health Magazine. And it was a major consumer health magazine, million circulation.
Right.
And my agent, Nat Sobel, who was also Raymond's agent, but we'd never met each other. He got a hold of me one day and he said, "How would you like to help Raymond Moody write a book?"
Hmm.
And then he pauses, and I said, "I don't know who Raymond Moody is." and he says, "Well, he's the man who named and defined the near-death experience." I said, "I don't know what a near-death experience is either." And so Nat said, he's a little abrupt sometimes. He said, for the editor of a major health magazine, you're not very smart. You need to learn what a near-death experience is. And so I decided to go to Georgia, where Raymond lived, and help him with the first book we did was The Light Beyond. And it was kind of a primer book about near-death experiences. He had written Life After Life 10 years before, and then it had kicked off this whole field of near-death studies. So we were supposed to take the studies that were done in that 10-year period and turn them into a book, and that's what we did. I wasn't really that interested in near-death experiences. But as I started writing it, and I spent time with Raymond, who's, a wonderful teacher, and I really got into it. And we finished The Light Beyond, and I said, there's something missing from this book, and that is that there's no studies with children. And he said, well, no one's done any studies except for Melvin Morse, who is a pediatrician. He lives in Seattle, and he's the only one I know of that's doing any research on children. So I flew to Seattle, and I talked to Melvin about his research. And he was just going to start a big research project looking at how people were transformed by near-death experiences. And so we chatted for a while and decided that he should write a book about what he'd experienced up to this point with children. And so I wrote a proposal for the book, and I was living in New York. He was in Seattle. I wrote this proposal for the book, took it to Nat. Nat loved it, sent it out to 20 publishers. And every single one of them except one rejected it. And they rejected it because they said, well, people don't care this much about their children. Our children lie all the time, or they don't have much to say about the experiences like this. and on and on. I mean, one of the editors rejected it because I had a single typo on page 2,
Mm.
and so I
Uh,
thought it was all over. But we got it. The book got accepted by Dying Reverend at uh, HarperCollins, and I was sitting there reading all the rejection letters, and she says, you know, if you handle this book okay, it's going to be a bestseller. And I looked at the rejection letters, and they said just the opposite. But
mm,
it turned out she was right, and there you go. That launched me, because what I do with every book that I do is I look for a vacuum. I look for something that isn't covered in the book,
mm.
and then that becomes my next book.
Yeah, it seems like you just pop these things out like candy. It's like, there's all these books, but it obviously comes from a strong passion and a need that you must see. I personally have to validate you being a 3-year-old infant who has had a near-death experience.
Hmm.
I know the outside world looks at children and really has a big misunderstanding, of kids. And there's a lot of, and when I go through this, there's so much just pushback. You're just a kid. What do you know? I mean, I'm interested with you, like studying and working alongside Dr. Melvin Morse, who you've mentioned. What have
Right.
you come to understand, with kids and their level of consciousness versus maybe how the world sees them? Like, where are we missing, kids at? Because it seems like kids are really one of the most misunderstood populations of our, on the planet for many
I would
ways.
say that's true. Yeah. The one thing that intrigued me about kids is they have this memory that's like a steel trap.
Mm,
And I had always thought it was just the opposite. I had my own children then too, but my kids had a great memory.
mm,
And when we started talking to other children who'd had these experiences, they had terrific memories too, right down to the point where they wanted to draw their near-death experience.
mm,
And we had several drawings that children would do about their experience.
mm,
And they weren't yet acclimated by the culture.
mm,
So if a child said, "Well, I saw this person of bright light," or "I saw an angel," because they knew about angels from church perhaps or TV, and they would say, "Well, I saw an angel," they just said it. They
mm,
didn't edge themselves like adults do. They aren't afraid to talk about what they have seen and what they've experienced.
mm.
And I thought that was very unique. Um,
Yeah.
we later talked to them more about uh, what they remembered and how they were transformed. And we realized that children, because they're so young, they don't have much of a life review, which
Mm,
which is a big component for near-death experiences in the adult world, the adult population. But they have really short, because they have short lifespans at that point. Uh, they don't remember much as far as a life review. But the exposure to a lot of them had the being of light. That's another component that's common in a near-death experience.
mm,
Is that generally a person leaves their body, they go through a tunnel, they see dead relatives, and they encounter a bright light,
mm.
something they describe as a being of bright light. And children were greatly transformed by that.
Yeah, that absolutely is truly spot on.
Yeah.
Now, there may be a parent, who is listening, and they may have a child who may be gifted or might possibly have had an NDE. You know, what could we speak to proper ways, to really manage, a kid who's tuned in or might have had a transformative experience? How could we allow kids, to really open up more? Because it seems like the biggest problem that happens is, and this happened to me, is that they will close themselves down because they are fearful of the world not understanding them, or, you know, so I think kids could go one of two ways. They could shout it off the rooftops, or like myself, it was just so sacred, it wasn't worth it to really talk to people out of the repercussions. It's just the juice was not worth the squeeze. So, to parents kind of watching, how could you speak to maybe, ways to kind of handle a kid who is tuned in or have had these things? How can we allow that to unfold?
Well, I think the primary therapy for a child in this case would be to encourage them to speak. Uh, Encourage them to speak and don't ridicule anything that they say. Listen to what they say,
Mm.
and you want them to remember the experience. That's primarily, I think, one of the things you want is for them to remember these experiences. So get them to talk, and try to get them to talk deep. Like you say, some kids just can't stop talking, and other kids just don't talk. So
Right.
you largely have to encourage them. And
Hmm.
that's what I would say. I think that's the best thing to do with the child is to just get them to start rapping about it.
Yeah.
You know, yeah,
Right. No, they have to feel safe and I guess a comforting, um, place to process their experiences. So absolutely. Now I'm just from your our discussion. I know you encountered Raymond, and met him. Were you someone who, like you said, you didn't believe in this stuff? Was there a particular case study that just blew your mind that you said, "Wow, this
yeah,
is there is something here," or was it more the accumulation of hearing some of these near-death experiences that caused you to have a degree of belief of a knowing of something greater than this reality?
yeah. Well, it was for one thing, it started out being an accumulation,
Mm.
and then I spent a lot of time with Raymond in his home in the South in Alabama. That at the time he's now moved to Florida, but uh, and he had this beautiful home that was built in 1850. It was one of the homes that weren't burned down by the Confederates as they came through.
Mm.
I guess it was the Union as they came through the
Mm.
South. And we would sit on the porch. We had a great creek, Choccolocco Creek, and we would sit there with people who'd come in and tell their stories. And uh, and that's when I started to run into some stories that were uh, truly convincing, like a woman named Vi Horton, who
Mm.
she had had gallbladder surgery,
Mm.
and she coded during gallbladder surgery. Gallbladder surgery is different now, as you know, than it used to be. It used to
Mm.
be a dangerous surgery. It's not so much now because they do it laparoscopically. But she coded and left her body, and when she could see everything and could recount conversations and the fear in the doctor's
Mm.
voice when he, was trying to get her heart started again. She left the operating room. She went into a waiting
Wow.
room and she
Mm.
saw her daughters were there waiting, and they
Mm.
had they had mismatched plaid on.
Mm.
And she later recalled that. She could recall conversations right down to the point where her brother-in-law was there, and he was going to go play golf, and he was told that she was in the hospital. So he came
Mm.
back to the hospital. He was on a payphone, and he called his golf partner, and he said, I can't play golf today. Vi's about to kick the bucket. She had
Hmm.
gallbladder surgery. She told him of that conversation later when she got to
Wow.
the room, and she recounted people who were in the waiting room, and could recall what they were, how they were dressed, what
Right.
they were there for, things like that. So that was really that opened my eyes, and then
Mm.
the hits just keep coming, because
Right.
when you talk to people who have had near-death experiences, oftentimes they've left their body, and oftentimes they can recall things that they shouldn't recall. And to me, that meant that they had their consciousness had left their physical being. Their consciousness had left their physical body.
Yeah.
That says a lot. I mean, to me, that says that your consciousness doesn't need uh, your physical body to survive, that it can leave and it can move on.
Mm.
And that means a lot right there. It means if your consciousness can leave your body, maybe it can stay away for a long time. And that's where the afterlife comes in. So it would be just one event like this after another.
Mm.
And that's what was convincing to me, for sure.
Must have been overwhelming to just kind of hear these things one after another, and how could you just not have your mind blown,
I know.
hearing these, encounters. And like you said, the evidential piece seemed to be the sticking point for yourself, where unless she was on, that particular cell phone on that golf course right next, to how in God's name would she possibly know this?
Right. Yeah, it's
It's,
but then
she's there in the hospital.
since then I've heard a lot of those people
Right.
leaving their body and being able to recall being somewhere else
Yeah.
accurately. What we call it accurately. So yeah, that's a very fascinating aspect of the
Yeah.
experience,
Right.
for sure.
Now, my question is twofold for you. Working in the field of research, what do you think of what's happening now with near-death experiences? Because, I had Raymond on, our channel and kind of asked him a similar question, but there seems to be this explosion
Yeah,
occurring right now with the interest that is there, and
sure.
just how people that I know who are just starting to get interested in this stuff, and they hit me up always talking about near-death experience as the first area of interest.
Right.
Why do you think that's going on? What's going on? With the current traction of interest in NDEs, like why all of a sudden now is it just seemingly exploding the way that it is?
Well, a couple things. One is cultural. The baby boomers are next in line
Mm,
to die, and we're finally, because I'm one of them, we're finally pushed into a corner where we really have to say, well, what's going to happen when I die? We'd always considered, and it's one of the three great questions: where did we come from? Why are we here? And where do we
mm,
go? And so now we're kind of pushed into a corner where we really have to think about that question: what happens when we die? That's one thing. But another thing that's increased the interest in near-death experiences is resuscitation.
mm,
Uh, because of changes in resuscitation, improvements in resuscitation, people who have cardiac arrest, for instance, which is the gold standard of a near-death
mm,
experience, they can go very deep into death and come
mm,
back. And that has changed the nature of the near-death experience. Near-death experiences are now longer, they're more detailed, and that's because of the changes in resuscitation.
mm,
So that's had a very profound effect on us. And people aren't afraid to talk about them anymore.
mm,
So I'll give you an example. Back when I was writing The Light Beyond, two things happened with The Light Beyond that have changed over the years. One, that I was, at the time that I was writing The Light Beyond with Raymond, I was also writing a book on reversing heart disease
mm,
with a doctor from Case Western University in Cleveland. And one day I was there in the hospital with him. We were standing around a nurse's station, and he said, "What are you working on besides this book, the one I was working on with him?" I said, "Oh, I'm working on a book on near-death experiences." And he says, "I've resuscitated hundreds of people. I have never seen a near-death experience. They
mm,
don't exist." And then he was called away from the nurse's station by a call over the PA system, and all the nurses came up to the desk and they said, "Well, we hear him all the time.
mm,
He
mm,
doesn't. He doesn't hear them because he doesn't talk to his patients. He puts
mm,
them in the recovery room and then he never sees them again. And
right,
we talk to the patients and they tell us stories like this. And they told me a whole bunch of stories. Uh, Doctors didn't want to admit that these happened, or they didn't
mm,
want to acknowledge that they happened, or they didn't know that they happened back in those days. Over the years, that's all changed. What's changed now is that doctors have seen their parents have them.
mm,
They've seen people should have died who were then resuscitated and told them stories. Uh, they've opened up about it,
mm.
and as a result, society looks at these very differently. So that's one of the reasons that I think they're, you excuse the cliche, coming out of the woodwork with these stories.
Yeah. Wow. There's a lot of evolutions and changes, and I certainly hope that the medical community can receive some type of education, within their work, or to come to a point of time. I know right now I'm leading a continual educational course for fellow therapists,
Really?
to manage clients who, for clinical interventions for clients who might have had these experiences. And I think as we evolve as a species, we have to keep up where people are at and destigmatize this phenomenon and recognizing it more and more as real and valid versus pushing it away, suppressing the experience or institutionalizing someone, like they used to, who have, had
Sure.
these type of phenomenon. My question is micro and macro for you on a personal and global scale.
Yeah.
We've mentioned before that near-death experiences are getting many tractions. Certainly, on my channel, I do not believe in salesmanship. I think we put out the information, and it's what people decide. They make their own conclusions. It's like a courtroom, as your book has discussed.
Right.
It's a courtroom. Here's what's going on. You make your conclusions.
And that's what we did with Proof of Life.
Yeah,
Consciously, we made it a very, I guess, conservative would be the word, conservative book. We didn't express our opinions about these. We want
right.
people to develop their own. But go ahead, sir.
Yeah, but I'm wondering, what have you personally gained from, studying near death experience? How has that changed your, you know, epistemology and your worldview? And for people who are interested, and there's no guarantees, but what particular area has it impacted for those who do follow NDEs that you've noticed? What are some of the trends as it may relate to grief and looking at, life in a broader sphere, mental health? What have you noticed?
Well, let me answer that with a study that I was involved in with Melvin Morris in Seattle. Melvin and several doctors and therapists as well. It was called the Transformation Study. And what we wanted to know was the transformative effects of near-death experiences
Mhm.
uh, in people who had had them over the years. So we had children, we had people who had had them as children, people who had had near-death experiences
Mhm.
at teenage, middle ages, and older. And total of 400 plus
Mhm.
people were involved in the study, were in the study as study subjects. And the goal, like I say, was to look at the transformative effects of the near death experience.
Mhm.
And what we found by administering a number of psychological questionnaires and other tests, and just talking to these people, and then talking to their spouses at times, was we noticed that overall they had a strong decrease in death anxiety.
Mhm.
They had a higher zest for living, which means that they were type A without the anger.
Mhm.
They, as a result of a near death experience, they also had a higher intelligence.
Mhm.
And as Melvin put it, people who have near death experiences evolve into higher beings.
Mhm.
And I think that's very true. They become far more thoughtful.
Mhm.
Uh, another interesting, they're less afraid of death. I've covered that. They have a greater appreciation of learning by far. So you frequently see people who have a near-death experience who then pick a subject and become scholars.
Mhm.
In a lot of ways. Uh, and then the freaky thing to me about the transformation study was that people had a measurable increase in psychic abilities,
Mhm.
which meant that on the average, a near-death experiencer would have about 4 times as many verifiable psychic experiences
Wow.
as a person who did not have an NDE. So a
Mhm.
verifiable experience would be you're going to extreme one would be you're about to take a flight
Mhm.
the night before you have a dream that the plane crashes. So
Mhm.
you get up in the morning, you tell your wife or you tell your spouse, uh, "Hey, I'm not going to fly today. I dreamed
Mhm.
that plane was going to crash," and it does. That's a very extreme example of a verifiable psychic experience.
Like a premonitional, future-oriented pull. Yeah.
Exactly. and we found that they have 4 times as many as the general population.
Mm. Mm.
So that's some of the transformation that takes place. Uh, there's others. A lot of people leave their religion,
Mm.
and they either quit being religious, but they feel that they're more spiritual,
Mm.
or they will change religions. You hear people of all things leaving their Baptist religion and becoming Catholics
Mm.
because they like the structure in the Catholic Church, and then
Right.
it will go the other way as well.
Hmm.
That's
It's one thing that's for certain with NDEs is the life that you had prior NDE, post NDE are, drastically different, and you see the trajectories of so many NDEers and the lives that they're living today. It's night and day different than their worldviews before. The changes are undeniable,
yeah.
uh, for certain. I'd like
And
to.
let me get something else in there I forgot to mention. It can also they have a higher rate of divorce.
Yeah, I've noticed that with a couple of my colleagues in the
Yeah,
field. They,
interesting. Huh?
and
You're no longer the same person.
yeah, when you change and you're at a certain level, it's hard to continue, that dynamic when you've made some radical changes in such a short amount of time.
Right.
You're a totally different person unless that person is able to accept or accelerate their changes to meet your timeline of change and evolution.
And then
It's hard.
bosses become a lot nicer. People,
Nicer.
people who met it might have been, aggressive, not very nice bosses.
Hmm.
Will become much kinder, much more understanding,
Oh yeah, yeah.
and that has at times affected their status in a corporation, for instance. They might end
Oh
up doing something else besides
yeah.
being.
No, I've noticed. Geez, I'm forgetting his name, but there was one near-death experiencer, Saved by the Light, Danny and Brinkley, who was I guess, one example of those who totally changed and, just became a totally different person in a way after his
Right.
NDE for sure.
Yeah, I wrote that book, Saved by the Light.
Oh, is that right? Wow,
Yeah.
wow.
Yeah.
Talking to
And,
the man himself. I think was it Julia Roberts' brother who might have played him in the movie?
yeah,
Or
he did, Eric. Yeah.
yeah, it was an old movie. I saw it like a year or two ago.
Well, that's a kind of a funny story because I was at a conference in Seattle. Raymond was there and Melvin,
Right.
and they had finished speaking, and a whole bunch of people came up, like 3 or 4 people, uh, and they said, I can't wait until I die
Mm.
to have a near-death experience. And I was there saying, I don't think that's the real message here, you know, and and I had heard some fairly horrifying near-death experiences. That people had gone through really some awful things and had their near-death experience.
Mm.
They had all the changes, but they were still not. They'd lost arms, legs, things like that. And
Right.
so I didn't like to hear that people thought the idea was to die instead of
Mm.
to live. And
Mm.
so I told Raymond, I said, I want to find the best near-death experience I can find, the
Mm.
person who suffered a lot and changed the most,
Mm.
and tell that single story. And he gave me a number of people to contact, and then he said, well, really the best one I've heard is Daniel Brinkley.
Mm.
And I had never met Daniel. He was kind of a legend. A lot of people talked about him
Mhm.
in this really small. It was a relatively small community of people who had gotten together and talked about near-death experiences. And uh, I'm at Raymond's house, and Raymond says, "You really have to meet Daniel. I know you never met him." And like 5 minutes later, Daniel comes blasting in the door. He's the type of guy who doesn't knock. And blasting in the door. I
Right.
remember, a T-shirt on. He had oil all over because he had some kind of a hepped up car and he'd been working on it. And he came in and started talking to Daniel. He didn't like me at all.
Mm.
Uh, uh, so he's wasn't very refined in those days. He's refined a lot. So
Mm.
he's very threatening to be around. Uh, I tried to play it cool because I didn't want to get punched. But later on, we had a chance to talk about his near-death experience.
Mm.
And I said, well, I'd really love to write a book about it.
Mm.
And a couple weeks later, he agreed to do that.
Wow.
And that's when we got, well, then we got uh, our book publisher to come down to Alabama to meet him.
Mm.
And he just did some kind of remarkable things. I mean, he read her like a book, for one thing.
His
It was,
psychic phenomenon after the end, yeah.
he had great psychic abilities, and they faded as he got older, which is
Mm.
common,
Mm.
with people who have these abilities. But he read her like a book.
Wow.
And she just, by the end of the day, she said, let's do a book together."
Mm.
And that was it. That's how it started. And I
That's
could never get Daniel to sit down for a long time and talk to me. He's different now. He's much calmer than he was. But
right.
I went to see him. We lived in Aiken, South Carolina,
Mm.
next to the police station. And he, when I would try to talk to him about his near-death experience, he would get distracted easily.
Mm.
People would come by and talk to him. He was getting phone calls, things like that. And finally, I said, "Look, I'm going back home. I live in
Mm.
Arizona. I'm going to go back home, and I'm going to talk to you on the phone because I noticed you focus better on the phone." And that's how we did uh, Saved by the Light, was through phone interviews, because I could actually focus him. That's all changed now. I mean, he's much more focused. He's a little more normal.
He's
Uh,
changed, he's evolved. But yeah, I mean, being in the field, that's one of the first books that people bring up, with your books and Raymond's books is, his book. So I thank you. You've done so much work, and you're always just, just seemingly like guiding a lot of souls. And I'm wondering, with near death experiencers, I mean, obviously people come from different parts of the world, but they all hit on the same thing. But I'm wondering, is there a rhyme or reason as to why specific individuals have near death experiences? Do you feel it's maybe a part of their blueprint? I mean, something so enormously impactful as a near death experience. Do you feel that's a part of maybe a soul contract, a lesson for that soul? Maybe that's a little bit too deep for the research and the work to verify. But I'm wondering why specific individuals like myself or others have these things. And at least I know for myself, but I think collectively, like what's the reason as to
yeah.
why specific individuals have these?
Well, the primary reason is you were close to death.
Mm.
I mean, that's the primary reason.
Mm.
And something happens. Now, there's a bunch of speculation on what happens,
Mm.
but something happens to someone who approaches death, or actually it achieves it through a cardiac arrest, and then is
Right.
brought back again. The thinking behind it is this: that on a daily basis, we're hit by millions and millions of bits of information.
Mm.
I mean, just, I couldn't even begin to count how many right now, just looking into a screen and talking to you and
Mm.
looking out my window and looking at leaves, the sky, everything else, the painting next to me. Uh, and there's a filter that the
Mm.
brain filters out information, so it's
Mm.
so it's comprehensible. And in the course of filtering that out, it filters out what some people say. It filters out a lot of uh, this parallel world
Mm.
that's around us,
Wow.
a supernatural world, actually, a paranormal world. And when one has a near death experience, that filter goes away. And they're then able, this other world, I'll call it, rushes in.
Wow.
And they're able to comprehend this whole other world that's around us, the world that we go to when we die.
Mm.
And that's one explanation. Lately, Sam Parnia, who's a researcher, is doing a very interesting study.
Mm.
Sam, he took a number of people who had died, and they were, in some cases, were covered up, in some cases, registered no brain waves and no whatever else you have to have, heartbeat, uh, for as long as an hour. And they were measured. They were in a hospital. They were in hospitals. I think they had 4 or 5 hospitals involved in this study.
Mm.
And then these people would come back,
Wow.
and that's because of the improved resuscitation techniques.
Mm.
But they were get coded, qualified as dead, and they had actually come back as much more than an hour later in some cases.
Wow.
What he said, what he talked to them about was what took place in that hour.
Mm.
And it's, you know, it's like they're like super NDEs,
Mm.
because once again they've gone so deep into death,
Mm.
and they would have very deep near-death experiences. They were describing other worlds, which is what people describe when they have near-death experiences, and have described since thousands of years ago. By the way,
Wow.
near-death experiences are nothing new. The name is new, but the actual experience is not new.
Thing going on. Yeah.
And Paparni has been able to really. In fact, I think I have something here. I should read it. Uh, So he looked at 53 survivors. He had a
Mm.
total of 567 patients. Just 53 survived. And he conducted interviews with those 28 of those people. And he said that nearly 40% reported some perceived awareness of the event without specific memories attached. And 20% seemed to have had a recalled experience of death.
Mm.
And many describe the event as a moral evaluation,
Wow.
which in our term would be a life review.
Mm.
And when people have a life review, it is kind of a moral evaluation.
Sure.
They see everything they've done, but it's not only that. There's an empathic element to it, where you feel everything that
Mm.
you've done to someone else, and it could be very unpleasant. But for the most part, it's not, because there's supposedly a guide, this being of light that almost everyone encounters,
Mm.
that helps interpret uh, their life,
Wow.
the high points and the low points,
Mm.
and is very forgiving, and they feel forgiven for the things they've done that are wrong. And these are very deep, obviously very deep near-death experiences, but it
Sure.
indicates where we're headed in society. Is that
Yeah. Well, it seems from what you're saying that there's a degree of an education from that you gather that we go through in life, and we have different lifetimes to maybe learn some of those lessons and have opportunities to learn, and that God may be different or whatever you want to call it than how maybe we're portrayed in a religious sense, that there's a possibility of an all-loving God who accepts us, doesn't punish us, but gives us opportunities to come back to the light, to expand the light and grow from our past. The last topic at hand, and I know this is a term that, correct me if I'm wrong, that you and Raymond have coined, is shared death experience. Is that right?
near-death experiences? Yeah, that's. I guess that is a term we coined. Although
Yeah.
I'll give you a little bit of background on it. Uh, uh, a shared death experience is when when consciousness can be proven after one is dead.
Mm.
That's essentially a shared death experience. But a shared death experience is also when a person who is well
Mm.
shares the death experience of someone who is dying.
Right.
So that can be a precognitive experience. An example of that would be uh, here's a couple from the book where people would wake up in the middle of the night. They would see someone standing at the foot of their bed, a friend,
Mm.
and the friend would say, I've passed away. I'm dying. I'm
Mm.
dead." And they would then wake up the next morning and find out that that was true, that that person had died. That's
Wow.
a shared death experience. They've shared their actual death. There's other types we cover. As odd as this is, well, out of body experiences are another one. Is
Mm.
that if they can accurately recall what they saw when they were out of
Mm.
body, then that is a shared death experience.
Mm.
And there's also a shared death experience in which, and doctors have talked about this, which is like a change I said earlier that doctors are now open. We had several doctors talk about seeing a mist rise from somebody as they die.
Hmm.
And that would be a shared death experience because they witness an action that takes place as that person is dying. And that mist sometimes hangs around for a while. I spoke to one doctor who said that he had a patient who was dying of cancer. He went into she was in some distress. It was late at night. He was working in a hospital, and he went in to adjust her oxygen. And he said all of a sudden this mist came out of her body
Wow.
and lingered for a while, and
Hmm.
then was sucked out of the room like it was sucked into a vacuum tube. Now, we've had about four of those doctors in opposite sides of the country who have had those.
Hmm.
Uh,
Wow.
yeah,
So, I mean, I know obviously Dr. Jeff O'Driscoll, was working with Jeff Olson, and he seemed to have some, that would be a shared death experience, I would say. But there's also a level of mysticism that is just beyond words, where it seems like a lot of times people, they may be so close to that loved one that they actually join that loved one. When they're crossing over, they experience what they're going through. And then there's a certain point that they have to just come back, that they can't continue on, and there's like a stoppage point that you
right.
see with. So much like NDEs, there seems to be a lot of layers of depth of the shared death
There
experience.
are, and it's all mixed up too. But with other types of shared death experiences. But Raymond had an experience when his mother
Yeah.
passed away, and he was so they were she was dying. They
Mm.
were surrounded. They surrounded her in the hospital. His family, and when she passed away, uh, they all had different types of experience.
Mm.
His sister saw their father at the foot of the bed, and someone else saw the father at the foot of the bed who had been dead for some
Right.
years. Uh, Raymond said the room seemed to change shape. As he put it, almost became like hourglass
Wow.
shape. And there were other things like the sense of going up,
Mm.
of going up into a tunnel with her. And so that was a shared death experience. And that's one of those ones that's shared by a number of people in the room.
Mm.
Uh, and those are coveted in my field because
Yeah.
they make for very interesting stories.
I feel if there's more awareness on the terminology, more people would say, "Oh, that was me." I had
Yeah,
that. I think, and this happened to myself when I was just a kid. I didn't know what a near-death experience was. I didn't know other people had it. There was no universality behind it. It was just this thing, and I thought I was the only one, and so I didn't have the vernacular, of language. So I credit you
right,
and Raymond for that term, because hopefully, as it gets more traction, more and more people could recognize that they have it, and I think that could lead to a sense of a belief, which
right,
can work with grief. As we know, belief and grief really, could go hand in hand.
sure.
Now,
I want to tell you
obviously,
how we came up with the shared death experience.
yes.
Is that as I said earlier, I'd worked with Raymond for 35 years, and in every book we wrote, we've written, this is the sixth book now. In all the early books, we had these events that were like shared death experiences
Mm.
where someone would die in one part of a hospital, or someone was critically ill in one part of a hospital, and they would be very sick, close to death, but they would see what was going on in the other part of the hospital with a
Mm.
relative who may have been there as a result, say, of an auto accident. And
Mm.
that would be a shared death experience, that they would come out of their near death experience and they would tell the doctor, my sister died in
Mm.
this same hospital. And the doctor would check and find that that was true. We've had a couple of those. But over the years, we kept having these experiences, like the ones I described, where um, we just called them, for want of a better phrase, shared death experiences.
Mm.
And to me, it implies that consciousness has left the body.
Mm.
that someone has died and their consciousness has left and has gone to for some reason
Right.
become present with someone else they knew. Not always a loved one, by the way. It can be with a complete stranger.
Right.
So we had those in books for like 4 of our books. We kept having these shared death experiences.
Mm.
And then Raymond had a shared death experience himself.
Mm.
Then I had one,
Wow.
and that changed our conversation
Yeah.
because we realized that we had somehow witnessed a separation of consciousness from the body.
And I'm
And
sure that elevated both of your work because now you're turning
sure,
from researchers and you're going on the other side of the aisle to be an experiencer. And it's
sure,
must be a unique position. And I at least know that there was a video that you and Raymond did, I think in the woods by Raymond's house.
right,
And you were just talking about your death experience. It was a lovely video. And I believe Elizabeth Vassan from Helping Parents Heal saw that video right after her son's passing. And that was so
yeah.
helpful
Is that right?
in her
Sure.
life. But I'm sure so many other people who have experienced grief have watched a lot of your videos, read your books, and they've been able to say, oh, that's what's happening. And to take a lot of ownership behind their experience. And it changes their whole life. The validation and the empowerment that you've provided to so many is beyond words.
Well, that's what's extraordinary about this book here, Proof of Life After Life.
Let's talk about it. Yeah. I
Yeah,
loved reading it, but yeah.
really, the extraordinary thing about it is this, is that a near-death experience is a subjective experience. So technically speaking, only one person can have that experience. Only one person
Right.
can describe it. Okay,
Mm.
even though there's so many near-death experiences now, and they are all, frankly, essentially the same.
Mm.
Uh, and there different things happen, but there's a certain traits that are common in near-death experiences. With the shared death experience, it's different because it's shared, because it's objective.
Mm.
And so you go from subjective to objective, and you have a whole different set of evidence because objective experience is always better evidence than subjective.
Wow.
And so that's what we did with this book is we collected shared death experiences. We essentially divided them up into 7 different categories,
Mm.
and that's what the book is contains is 7 different categories of objective death experiences that
Mm.
are, to me become undeniable. I mean, you can say to a near-death experiencer, "Well, you're the only one who experienced it, so
Mm.
have a nice day." But if you have an objective experience, it's totally different.
Yeah. Wow. So, for readers of this book, what would you recommend in terms of the mindset? And, what are some of the biggest takeaways from this book that people could gain or
Well,
just kind of, just learn? Because I found it to be a wonderful book filled with, a lot of case studies, and different set of data and information. And I'm just wondering your overall viewpoint of the book, and just the summarization of it all.
well, I I would say this, and reasonably speaking, we all have fear of death.
Mm.
I know some people have less than others. That's definite, but we all have a fear of death. So I
Mm.
don't think it's really realistic to tell an audience that they shouldn't have fear of death. But what I
Mm.
like to tell them is instead, I tell them to study the literature that indicates the survival of bodily death.
Mm.
Talk to those who have had NDEs or SDEs because they're all around you.
Mm.
And figure out a way to bring up the subject when you're in a group, and you'll be amazed at how it changes the conversation. Uh, so, but overall, fear is just oftentimes a lack of knowledge.
Mm.
And so, my advice to them is just don't fear education, because in the end, education is really your friend. Be open ended when you read about this stuff. Don't come at it from a point of being a disbeliever.
Mm.
Just try to be a believer for a while. And I
A
think
healthy skeptic,
a
in other.
healthy skeptic, yeah, you'll come up with entirely different
Yeah.
conclusions.
Yeah. And Proof of Life After Life is available on Amazon, and I'm sure, all major platforms. If people want to ask maybe specific questions, do you have like a website or a
Yes,
contact for people who may,
thank
have
you.
specific inquiries for yourself?
In the book, we have a couple of websites. There's mine and Raymond.
Hmm?
Raymond's is lifeafterlife.com, and mine is paulperryproductions.com.
Okay.
And in both of those, you can go to the blog page and communicate with us, and we'll actually communicate back. And if you have a shared death experience or a near death experience that you want to talk to us about, let us know. Let us know. Include your phone number and email address, preferably email, and we'll get back together with you. Yeah.
I know you will. Any final words? And we'd love to have you back on the channel. I know for you, you're always, there's always a project or some book going on with you. You have a
Right.
clear calling of service, and I admire that deeply of you. But
Thank you.
any last words to our audience that comes to mind to just kind of close the loop of our wonderful dialogue,
Wow.
here today?
I
I
was
know there's a
just,
lot to say, but anything that's popping, any wood burning that's going on, just let
yeah.
it go.
Stay open. Stay open, and you'll find out things that if you've had a near death experience and you keep it corralled inside, open up, and you'll find a lot of friends. You'll find a lot of friends. I'll give you one example. Early on, once again, when I first started writing with Raymond, I went to a Denny's restaurant
Hmm.
at night. I'd been out with a bunch of friends going to a movie, and after the movie was over, we were having whatever you have at Denny's, and we were talking about what we're all up to, and someone asked me about what I was writing, and I told them about near death experiences,
Hmm.
and they said, "Well, that's BS. That does not happen." So I could easily have closed up then, but I decided not to.
Oh.
So I stood up in this Denny's. It was very late at night. There was probably 20 people in there. And I announced what I was doing, who I
Right.
was, what I was doing. And I described a near death experience to them. Has anyone in here had one of these? Or do you know of anyone in your family or any friends that have had them? There were about 20 people. 15 people stood up and told stories. A
Hmm.
couple were people who had had them themselves, but the rest, it was family members, it was grandparents.
Hmm.
They had grandparents who had seen things happen, and on and on. This always seems to go through grandparents for some reason. But and to me, it was a change in atmosphere
Hmm.
because you're talking about something that in those days it's less now. Something that people kept tightly held with inside them. But
Hmm.
all of a sudden, you say, "Hey, these are near-death experiences," and you give them a peg to hang their experience on.
Yeah.
They realize that, hey, there's millions of people who've had these,
Right.
and before that, they didn't know that. So they're willing to open up on the weird things that happen in their lives.
Yeah. And
So
if they say if you can name it, you could tame it. So having that identification, that awareness, and the right environment to process with, who's not going to have pushback or judgment, but
right,
acceptance and understanding and uh, empathy for what you went through. So
I'm going to
Paul
steal
Perry,
that phrase
yeah.
from if you can name it, you can tame it. So
I'm sorry.
I'm going to steal that phrase from
I,
you.
I wish I wish that was mine. I would but I've heard it somewhere. And as a therapist, sometimes we use it in the right
Yeah,
circumstances. But Paul Perry, thank you so much for all your
thank you,
work,
Jake.
and thank you for being a guest in the Wisdom of Jacob's Ladder. And to my viewers, please check out Proof of Life After Life. I loved reading it, loved endorsing it, and
Yeah,
I will stand by any of Paul and Raymond's work. I think they are impacting so many souls, and I think the universe chose the right couple to work together. It's a perfect marriage, and they're helping out so many. So, Paul, thank you for all that you do, and
thank
keep
you,
on
Jake.
keeping on. Yeah,
All right, take care, man.
you too, my brother. Thank you. That was a wonderful interview. I thank Paul for his generous time and for coming on. I really loved a lot of content that he provided, as well as giving credibility, to just higher consciousness and more than our own bodies. And I love the work that he does, with Raymond as a co-author, and someone who partners with him, in projects. So thank you for tuning into our interview. Please make sure you continue to come to my channel, and you could do that by subscribing, as well as hitting the bell notification icon for more interviews like this that we had today coming your way each and every week. And we hope you really got a lot out of information and wonderful stories that Paul was able to share to really enhance our everyday life, and building a case of your own for your own belief set of belief systems, of life after death and higher consciousness. Thank you all for tuning in. Let's stay connected, and we'll see you next week coming here on the Wisdom Jacob's Ladder. Be well. Much love.